Oh, sorry, yeah, stop again.
Yeah, stop.
Aren't we going to cut this part out of our YouTube?
Actually, yeah, go.
Yeah.
Can we do that?
Yeah, actually.
So now it's done.
Yeah.
Okay, go.
Welcome. Today we are presenting the Group 10 poster titled Protect the Work of the Oldest Country in the World. Got that right. Let's start again.
And a bit louder. I think we're going to be really
Yeah, you
loud.
go.
Really ram it, yeah.
Oh, fuck, that's scary. Corinne's getting a bit annoyed over here.
Yeah, I can tell. She's not happy with
She's
big boy.
Alright, I have to go and home now.
Oh, no. Yeah, fair enough.
Okay. Are you sure we can cut? Like,
Yeah, we can.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. So we can just
I'll
continue.
be a
Are you sure? But if it's on YouTube, can I rip it off YouTube?
Yeah, if you want to.
Why don't
You're
we
just going to have to post it.
Just stop and start.
But we're going to have to do it anyway because...
From the beginning.
Yeah, from the beginning.
When she goes into the...
Because otherwise we're going to...
Okay, look, I'm pretty sure we'll find a way.
Otherwise,
we're still recording.
We can do no, we should be fine. Okay, cool. All right, go.
Welcome. Today we are presenting the Group 10 poster titled Protect the Work of the Oldest Culture in the World. The purpose of this poster is to reflect upon Australia's current legislative framework and its inadequacies in protecting Indigenous culture and intellectual property rights. These rights are commonly referred to as Indigenous heritage rights. Indigenous heritage rights extend to cultural practices, resources, spirituality, and knowledge. The heritage rights pertinent to this poster are music, dance, songs, stories, and artwork. I'd like to introduce Sebastian, who will further discuss the background.
Cultural heritage is seen as the total ways of living built up by a group of human beings, which is passed from one generation to the next, given to them by reason of their birth. Indigenous Australians have one of the longest standing cultures in the world, dating back over 60,000 years. In Australia, Indigenous communities keep their cultural heritage alive by passing their knowledge, arts, rituals, and performances from one generation to another. It uses a variety of old techniques, including drawing rocks and painting with red pigment on bark. The Indigenous culture is fundamental to the lives of Australian Aboriginals as it facilitates their well-being. The language, law, and connection to the land in relation to the cultural activities are very meaningful to Aboriginal people as it defines them as a group. The Australian Aboriginal culture and artwork is very important to their lives as it tells many stories about their environment, plants, and animals, which are believed to be extinct for over 20,000 years. The rock art tradition, mainly as paintings in rock shelters and as engravings on exposed rocks, has continued to the present. Some of the most ancient paintings in rock shelters in northern Australia depict people dressed for ceremony and dancing with similar body decoration and accoutrements to those worn in ceremonies to this day, again revealing the great age of Aboriginal culture.
Thanks, Sebastian. The issue of copyright and intellectual property laws are becoming increasingly relevant to Aboriginal people. When research projects involving traditional stories are published, the copyright usually ends up with the non-Indigenous author because of the requirements of the Copyright Act 1968. That the work must be original, have been reduced to material form, and have an identifiable author. The Copyright Act as it stands is unsuited to protecting Indigenous culture because it is focused legally on individualistic commercial concepts rather than notions of communal ownership or the cultural integrity of work. Indigenous cultures, stories, information, and knowledge are passed from generation to generation by oral means. Generally, under the Copyright Act, once these stories are published in books and other documents, the person responsible for translating the oral story into written form is recognized as having copyright over that text. Similarly, when a performance of a previously unpublished story or dance is recorded on film or audio tape, the maker of the recording is acknowledged legally as owning the film or tape. In this way, copyright only protects the material medium rather than the idea or concept.
For quite some time, the protection of Indigenous cultural and intellectual property.
To exacerbate.
No, I'm sorry. I forgot totally that you were
That's okay, Jesse.
splitting it.
I will now pass it on to Claire to further this point.
To exacerbate the problem the copyright periods have a limited duration, which again conflicts with Indigenous cultural heritage, where ownership is essentially infinite. Indigenous people have been victim of unethical practices such as paying the artists unfairly, selling fake art, falsifying the creator of the art, no recognition and no allocation of royalties. Provision is made within the Copyright Act 1968 for the existence of industry codes of practice to protect copyright. And currently in Melbourne, there is the Melbourne's Code of Practice, which was developed to oversee Indigenous art galleries and retailers. On a national level, there is the National Indigenous Art Commercial Code of Conduct and Associated Ethical Trade Strategies, 2009. Whilst these codes serve as building blocks, they are not adequate to protect Indigenous cultural material in a mandatory or comprehensive manner.
For quite some time, the protection of Indigenous cultural and intellectual property in Australia has been a contentious legal and access to justice issue identified by government and numerous investigative reports. In particular, the intricacies of the acknowledgement of communal ownership of Indigenous arts and material and its subsequent exclusion from the Copyright Act as it stands. In Australia, Indigenous customary law has been widely recognised at common law, but chiefly in the Mabo case, which reinforced the important place that customary law has in our modern society. The perceived judicial activism arising from the Mabo case clearly identified an area of law that was worthy of discussion and development. However, this has not yet translated to the statutory protection of Indigenous cultural and intellectual property. In fact, amendments have been proposed to the current Copyright Act that sought to recognise communal Indigenous intellectual property, but have failed to gain support. However, a clear contradistinction is that under the Copyright Act, material is protected, subject to it being original, has material form, and has an identifiable author. As a result, the law does not currently extend to the communal ownership of traditional Indigenous stories and ideas, which are central to the Australia Aboriginal culture.
In order to progress this area of law and initiate change, there are a range of options available. Firstly, contact your local MP to discuss the issue. Community support and discussion is a great way to promote legislative change in the area. Secondly, we must acknowledge cultural heritage and customary law in order to move the issue forward. Incorporating traditional Aboriginal culture in the community will encourage others to support the cause. Another way to help is to develop an informed opinion through education. The Our Culture, Our Future report provides an informative and accurate explanation of the issues faced by Aboriginal artists. We must also look at setting up community legal centres in order to educate Aboriginal artists about the current laws and how they can best protect their artwork. Lastly, to join the cause and help support legislative change, log on to a website such as change.org and start a petition. Encourage like-minded people to support your petition and discuss it with your local MP.
In conclusion, we'd like to reiterate the need for more focus on Indigenous culture and intellectual property rights in Australia. Thank you for listening to our presentation. We're going to do this again.
Sorry,
Let's play it.
Let's play it. I think that's fine, but it's just natural.
Yeah.
Yeah, so let's just play it, see how it goes.